On a cold Monday morning in October 2009, Travis Thornton rolled into Wabash River Grain outside Terre Haute in a 1996 Ford F-250 with 312,000 miles, rust eaten through both rear fenders, and a cracked driver's side mirror tied in place with baling wire. The truck rattled at idle and leaned slightly to the right because the rear spring pack had one fatigued leaf. He stepped out in faded tan coveralls with two-stitched knee patches, a canvas coat with a broken zipper pull, and gloves mended at the fingertips with black thread. He looked like exactly what most people in Vigo County thought he was, a decent man who worked hard, got by, and probably floated from one thin year to the next. Nolan Pike watched him from the elevator office window while sipping coffee from a stainless travel mug, stamped with the logo of his new 2008 Chevrolet Silverado 3/4-ton parked out front. Nolan wore pressed jeans, a clean quarter zip, and boots with no mud caked in the tread. He had the kind of polished confidence that came from handling other people's grain tickets and reading their settlement patterns for 14 seasons. He knew who prepaid fertilizer and who delayed it. He knew who took operating notes in March and who rolled them in November. He knew who had liens filed against machinery and who asked for split checks to calm creditors. In coffee shop conversation, he repeated one judgment often enough that it became local fact. Travis survives because he never tries to grow. That verdict sounded reasonable if all anyone studied was visible equipment. Travis still hauled corn in two older wagons bought used in 1998. He still lived in the same one-story farmhouse his grandparents bought in 1958 for $11,400, white paint faded and porch railing repaired with plain pine. He still brought his own thermos to meetings and never ordered lunch in town. Yet the real ledger sat nowhere near the coffee crowd. By the time Nolan was saying Travis lacked ambition, Travis had quietly paid cash for 480 acres over 14 years, held $1,280,000 in laddered treasury bills, and carried zero term debt. He treated anonymity like a crop input. Not glamorous, highly productive. The arithmetic did not begin with luck. It began in March 1987, when Travis was 14, and standing beside his father on frozen gravel at a foreclosure auction 2 counties west. The farm was not theirs. It belonged to neighbors, the Cormicks, who had borrowed heavily in the late 1970s when rates looked manageable and land values looked permanent. Their variable debt had reset upward, then reset again, then crossed into numbers that no yield projection could service. Travis watched machinery sold in 6-minute increments and watched grown people avoid eye contact because shame traveled faster than pickup trucks in farm country. On the drive home, his father said one sentence that stayed with him longer than any sermon: borrowed money is rented control. By late November 1994, Travis had added a second lesson. His grandfather, Vernon Thornton, died and left no dramatic fortune, no hidden oil royalties, no insurance windfall. He left discipline and land records. 160 acres of paid-off ground came through family transfer, with stepped-up basis paperwork handled cleanly, and the farmhouse remained in a simple trust that required property taxes to be paid on time every year, without exception. Vernon had kept a narrow-ruled ledger in a desk drawer. Every page carried the same structure: gross income, essential costs, repair reserve, tax reserve, cash retained. No motivational language, just columns. Travis was 19, and he decided he would run his life the same way. He took custom hauling jobs in winter, repaired bins for neighbors in spring, and did not finance lifestyle upgrades. In 1995, his gross farm and side work income totaled $86,240. Total living expenses came to $17,980. Machinery repair and parts were $14,300. Seed, chemical, and fertilizer were $31,540. Tax and insurance obligations were $9,870. Cash retained at year-end was $12,550. In 1996, with stronger yields and one additional custom hauling contract, gross income reached $104,900 and retained cash increased to $21,430. In 1997, he retained $38,700 and bought his first 6-month Treasury bills at an annualized yield of 5.46%. He liked the structure: liquid, predictable, and boring. Boring fit the plan. The land sequence followed the same logic. In 1998, he bought 62 acres adjoining his north boundary for $74,400 cash at $1,200 per acre when the seller needed a clean close in 30 days. In 2000, he bought 48 acres of mixed ground for $67,200 cash at $1,400 per acre because tile repairs scared off finance buyers. In 2002, he purchased 95 acres for $180,500, again cash, after an estate sale required immediate settlement. In 2004, he added 71 acres for $170,400 at $2,400 per acre. In 2006, he acquired 84 acres for $252,000 at $3,000 per acre. In 2008, when several operators were overextended from high input assumptions, he closed on 120 acres at $4,250 per acre, total $510,000 without bank paper. 14 years, 480 acres, paid in full. None of that changed his visible habits, and that was intentional. He drove equipment until economics, not image, demanded replacement. He bought his 1978 Combine at a retirement auction for $19,800 in 2003, then rebuilt wear points in stages for $3,200, $2,640, and $4,910 over 6 years. A comparable financed newer Combine package, promoted in 2009, carried a purchase price of $286,000 with 10% down and a 7-year note near 6.9%, roughly $3,780 per month before seasonal cash flow stress. Travis preferred cash repairs and incremental downtime over fixed monthly obligations that ignored weather. Travis kept one question in front of him whenever neighbors mistook polish for strength. When the next credit squeeze hit, who was actually safer? The producer with cleaner paint or the producer with clean balance sheets? By then, he believed the answer was already visible in the numbers. In January 2010, Travis tightened his system. He separated operating cash into 3 accounts: immediate inputs, repair reserve, and opportunity reserve for distressed land or equipment. He kept 12 months of property tax and insurance in a dedicated sub-account and never touched it. He itemized personal spending with the same restraint his grandfather used. Property taxes and insurance on the house and owned parcels averaged $28,600 per year at that stage. Utilities and basic home maintenance were $8,900. Food was $6,700. Health coverage and out-of-pocket medical costs averaged $11,400. Clothing and boots were $780. Church and local giving averaged $3,600. Total non-farm household spending came to about $59,980 in a year, where gross receipts could swing above $900,000. He was not living small because he lacked options. He was living small because volatility had memory. By the second week of September 2011, his Treasury ladder had become a quiet machine. He held positions maturing every 13 weeks, 26 weeks, and 52 weeks, reinvesting most proceeds and redirecting only what the farm needed. Weighted average yield that year was modest compared with land appreciation. But liquidity was the point. If input prices jumped or a neighbor needed to sell quickly, he could move in 48 hours without pleading with the loan committee. That flexibility created discounts. Conventional financing often erased with delay. Over one 12-month stretch, he captured $96,000 in combined purchase discounts on fertilizer timing, used parts lots, and one parcel close simply because he could wire funds immediately. Nolan saw none of those internal mechanics. He saw patched coveralls and older wagons. He saw a man who did not attend sponsored grower trips and did not stand around discussing horsepower. In winter meetings, Nolan talked scale in polished language and quoted projected efficiencies from larger financed equipment fleets. Travis listened, nodded once, and signed his grain settlements without commentary. His silence was misread as timidity. It was risk management through low visibility. When spring 2012 approached, pressure built across the county. Drought forecasts hardened. Anhydra's quotes rose fast enough to make veterans swear under their breath. The elevator announced a new loyalty growth package that bundled seed prepay, chemical, drying priority, and equipment referrals on variable credit starting at 8.25%. Nolan framed it as modern necessity and warned in public that operators without scale would be gone in 3 seasons. In one crowded meeting, he turned toward Travis and asked why he was still running a 1978 combine worth less than 1 monthly payment on new iron. Travis folded the packet once, set it on the table, and gave the same answer he had given for years. I do not borrow to feel bigger. The room went quiet for half a breath after he said it. Then chairs scraped and coffee cups tapped as conversation restarted around him, louder than before, the way people get loud when they decide someone has said something backward. Nolan smiled without warmth, lifted the loyalty packet, and read the headline again as if repetition could force agreement. Variable operating credit at 8.25%. Seed prepay rebate of 2.1%. Chemical bundle discount of $18 per acre if financed through the elevator line. Drying priority during peak moisture weeks. Equipment referral incentives through a partner dealer in Clay County. Nolan held the page between 2 fingers and looked directly at Travis's patched knees. You are leaving margin on the table, he said. That combine is older than half this room. Travis put both hands on the table edge. I know every sound it makes. By the following Friday, the social judgment had hardened into county gossip. At the diner on State Road 63, men who had never seen Travis's ledgers said he was too cautious for modern grain. At the co-op parking lot, one younger operator asked whether he was afraid of growth. Nolan did not have to repeat the criticism anymore. It moved on its own. Visual evidence did the work. The 1996 Ford with oxidized paint, 312,941 miles now, mirror still wired, 2 gravity wagons with faded red sides, boots were sold twice in Terre Haute for $84 each time instead of replaced for $240. If appearance were accounting, the verdict was settled. But appearance was theater, and Travis had never confused theater with math. He spent that weekend at his kitchen table with legal pads, not because he was undecided, but because discipline for him meant documenting the decision before acting on it. If he took the package for 1,260 cropped acres, his projected financed input bill at the elevator's spring assumptions came to $312,700. At 8.25% variable, annualized over an average 9-month carry, interest expense alone would be about $19,347 before any adverse reset. If rates moved to 9.75%, which no one in that room expected then, the same carry cost rose to $22,841. If fall basis widened by 26 cents per bushel during a forced harvest sale window and he moved 214,000 bushels in that window, gross revenue compression would exceed $55,000. Cheap credit was not cheap when paired with bad timing. He wrote a second column: cash path, seed, fertilizer, chemical, and planned in-season repairs paid immediately for $186,400 because he had bought portions early and stored dry inputs where practical. Additional grain bin expansion of 110,000 bushels, total installed cost $241,600, paid from maturing treasury bills and an opportunity reserve. No note, no lien filing, no monthly payment schedule that ignored rainfall, basis, or fuel spikes. Higher upfront outflow, lower fragility. Before we go any further, keep one number in front of you. $186,400 paid once can hurt. $186,400 financed repeatedly can own you. Monday morning, he drove to 3 suppliers and settled each invoice the same day. At Klein Ag Supply, invoice 44719 totaled $72,880 for nitrogen blend and micronutrient amendments. He paid by wire and took a 1.5% prompt pay reduction, net $71,786.80. At River Bend Seed, invoice 1183 was $61,240. Immediate payment cut it to $60,015.20. At Madsen Repair and Fabrication, he authorized $14,930 in preseason, combine and auger work, plus a contingency envelope of $8,000 for bearings and belts. Parts costs in his system were never surprises, they were line items. Nolan noticed because settlement clerks notice everything. He called Travis that afternoon and tried one more time. You can preserve your cash and let the crop float the cost. The crop already has a job, Travis said. It pays next year before it pays this year. By late October 2012, yields came in below county optimism, but above local panic, and the bins made the difference he expected. Instead of dumping into harvest congestion, he sold 18% at harvest to cover immediate taxes and payroll, then released the rest in scheduled increments across 12 months: November, January, March, June, and August. Weighted average sale price landed at $5.61 per bushel on corn that many neighbors cleared closer to $4.98 net after basis penalties and drying delays on 1,300 bushels sold through that cycle. The spread produced roughly $126,819 in additional gross revenue. Storage had not made him rich. It had made him less vulnerable to everyone else's bottleneck. 3 days into January 2013, Nolan stood in the elevator hallway with 2 board members and said Travis's method could work only for small operators. The statement sounded plausible because debt-fueled expansion was still common wisdom. That year, Caleb Dunn borrowed $940,000 at 5.1%, structured as $520,000 for 2 leased quarters with option terms, $280,000 for machinery upgrades, and the balance for working capital. Caleb was not reckless. He was diligent, up before dawn, known for immaculate maintenance logs. He modeled 4.85 corn and stable interest. He did not model rapid basis deterioration, plus rate resets, plus a wet harvest. By 2018, carrying costs and lower net pricing had turned thin months into red months. In 2019, he surrendered 2 leased quarters to stop the bleed and still owed enough that his family delayed medical procedures and deferred roof repairs on their house. Maria and Joel Benton made a similar decision for reasons that also sounded rational at the time. Their dryer bottleneck had cost them quality discounts for 3 seasons, and their dealer offered a package, $410,000 for a high-capacity dryer installation and handling system, plus a $620,000 tractor and planter bundle, blended financing with an attractive opening period and step-up terms later. They signed because they wanted to protect labor, timing, and field windows while raising 2 children and caring for Joel's mother. When corn settled below $3.40 and input costs did not cooperate, the payment structure turned from manageable to punishing. By winter 2019, they missed 3 payments, negotiated extensions, then sold a small parcel they had hoped to keep for their daughter. Ellis Shaw was older and thought he had insulated the next generation by guaranteeing his son Tate's $1,200,000 operating line. The guarantee was a vote of confidence and a family promise. Then came weather variance, price pressure, and higher financing costs. By 2020, both operations were dragged into the same legal net. Foreclosure notices were posted. Auctioneers came. Ellis did not lose his dignity, but he lost machinery he had owned for decades and watched strangers bid on tools his son had expected to inherit. Priya Nolan ran a mixed grain and cattle operation with uncommon discipline, and even she got trapped by timing. She took a variable note at 4.75% to bridge feed and expansion costs during what looked like a favorable cycle. By 2022, the rate had climbed above 9%, while feed and fuel fought her on every side. To stay current, she sold half her herd, not because she lacked skill, but because variable debt can turn a temporary squeeze into a structural one. None of these people were foolish. They were serious operators working from assumptions that held until they did not. If you have seen good people crushed by one financing decision that made sense at signing, you already know this is not a morality play. It is a volatility story. Travis kept moving in the opposite direction, and he did it without speeches. In 2013, he acquired 140 acres from an estate at $5,200 per acre, total $728,000 cash, closing in 12 business days because no bank committee review was required. In 2014, he purchased a used grain cart and header trailer package for $42,600 at auction. New equivalent quoted by a dealer was $213,000 with freight. In 2015, he replaced bin fans and monitoring hardware for $38,200 and cut spoilage losses by an estimated 0.7% of stored volume. In 2016, he bought 165 acres at $5,850 per acre, total $965,250, funded by retained earnings plus treasury maturities. In 2017, his all-in production cost averaged $3.14 per bushel against a county average published near $3.93. In 2018, he was at $3.09, while county estimates pushed above $4. By 2019, his liquid reserves and short-duration securities reached $3,940,000, and owned acreage stood at 1,260. He still showed up in the same truck. Same wire on the mirror. Same coat with repaired zipper pull, now replaced by a loop of braided twine. One afternoon, a seed rep asked if he had considered upgrading his image. Travis looked past him toward the loading scale and said, "Image does not pay interest." By the second week of March 2021, rate pressure had started to move from rumor to invoices. Operators carrying large revolving notes saw annual interest expense jump from numbers that were painful to numbers that were destabilizing. One producer with a $2,400,000 floating stack moved from roughly $132,000 annual interest at blended terms near 5.5% to more than $206,000 when rates reset above 8.5%. Another crossed $240,000. These were not abstract percentages anymore. They were canceled machinery repairs, delayed rent payments, family stress, and emergency grain sales at bad basis levels. Wabash River Grain was not immune. Its own credit covenant tightened as lender scrutiny increased. Margin requirements changed. Reporting windows narrowed. Nolan kept speaking the language of temporary pain for permanent gain, but even board members who had defended him began reading covenant language, line by line. Debt risk had stopped being personal. It was becoming systemic across the entire local chain, from input financing to grain settlement timing. In January 2023, at a closed board session held in a cinder block conference room that smelled faintly of dust and coffee, the numbers finally stripped the argument down to essentials. Without $2,800,000 in fresh equity inside 10 days, the bank could freeze the elevator's seasonal line and force distressed settlement procedures that would hit producers regardless of how conservative their own operations were. Debt-free farmers could still be trapped if their buyer failed. Travis sat at the far end of the table in faded coveralls, legal pad open, handwriting small and square. Nolan arrived in a new jacket with the elevator logo stitched over the chest and repeated that aggressive growth was still the path forward. No one interrupted him. Then the board chair asked whether anyone had a workable alternative with immediate capital and governance terms that protected producers from repeating the same cycle. Travis closed the pad, looked once at the ledger pages in front of him, and for the first time in that room spoke longer than a single sentence. Private discipline is not enough if the system can still trap careful people. I will fund stability, but only with rules that cap exposure, force fixed-rate disclosure, and build a hardship pool before bonuses. Otherwise, this is just new money feeding old habits. The board chair, Harold Vance, did not answer immediately. He tapped a pencil twice, then asked the only question that mattered in that moment. Can you document that in numbers we can govern by, not opinions we can argue about? Travis pulled a manila folder from his coat and slid it to the center of the table. Inside were ledger copies, settlement summaries, treasury statements, land closing sheets, and one handwritten page titled Exposure Limits. He had highlighted nothing. He trusted columns more than emphasis. Start with progression, he said. Harold read silently for 20 seconds, then passed the top sheet to the next director. Nolan stayed back in his chair, jaw set, arms crossed, trying to look unimpressed. The room settled into paper sounds and shallow breathing. The first page was not dramatic. It was a year-by-year sequence, the kind accountants respect and storytellers usually skip, which is exactly why it carried weight. 2010. Gross grain and livestock receipts, $912,430. All-in operating costs $645,980. Net before tax, $266,450. Treasury purchases at year-end, $180,000. No term debt. 2011. Gross, $988,210. Operating costs, $701,340. Net before tax, $286,870. Treasury ladder holdings, $1,280,000. Cash reserve for inputs and repairs, $410,000. 2012. Cash paid inputs and repairs, $186,400. New paid in full storage, 110,000 bushels, for $241,600. Weighted corn sales, $5.61 per bushel through stage release. Estimated gain versus harvest-only sale, window $126,819. 2013. Estate land purchase, 140 acres at $5,200 per acre. Total $28,000 cash. Owned acreage increased to 780. Production cost $3.28 per bushel. 2014. Auction equipment package, $42,600 versus dealer, quote, $213,000 comparable. Avoided finance payment stack estimated at $38,400 annually. Production cost $3.23. 2015. Storage efficiency upgrades $38,200. Spoilage and handling loss reduction 0.7% on 240,000 bushels equivalent. Retained grain value preserved approximately $33,264 at average net price. 2016. Land purchase, 165 acres at $5,850 per acre. Total $965,250. Owned acreage, 900 to 45. Treasury and cash liquidity after close $2,140,000. 2017. Gross $1,462,300. Operating cost $946,870. Net before tax $515,430. Production cost $3.14 per bushel against county estimate $3.93. No term debt. 2018. Basis management and storage timing added estimated $141,900 gross lift across corn and soybeans. Production cost $3.09 versus county above $4. Liquidity $3,020,000. 2019. Owned acreage 1,260 after additional paid cash closes. Liquid reserves and short duration securities $3,940,000. 2020. Conserved cash through volatile year, postponed non-essential capital spend of $312,000. Maintained 12-month tax and insurance reserve untouched. 2021. Input inflation absorbed without credit draw. Average fertilizer cost per acre rose 31%. Total input outflow increased $224,000 year over year, paid cash. 2022. Treasury maturities redeployed into 13-week and 26-week bills at higher yields, preserving liquidity for potential countercyclical intervention. January 2023. Immediately available liquid position for emergency action, $2,850,000, with additional committed capacity, $600,000 if governance reforms adopted. No one spoke while the pages kept moving around the table. Travis did not fill the silence. He watched Harold's expression change from caution to concentration. Numbers did that. They forced people to choose between ideology and arithmetic. Before anyone stood to leave, Harold instructed outside counsel to duplicate the ledger packet and verify source documents against filings and bank confirmations. The next morning, copies were in counsel's hands. By the end of the second day, wire confirmations matched. Closing statements matched county records. The arithmetic stayed intact under independent review. At the follow-up session, in the same room and with the same folders stacked in front of each chair, Harold asked for the second packet, the one labeled Comparative Burden. That was where Travis had placed the uncomfortable material. Not his gains, but the cost structure that had swallowed careful neighbors who were never trying to gamble. He began with Caleb Dunn because Caleb had allowed him to. Caleb's 2013 borrowing profile was built on reasonable assumptions for that year, Travis said. $940,000 total at 5.1% blended. 2 leased quarters under option terms. Equipment update to avoid downtime. Working capital cushion. At signing, projected annual debt service and interest burden sat near $100,000 to $27,000. Manageable under 4.85 corn and average basis. But rates and basis did not remain average. He turned one page. By 2018, blended carrying cost moved above $168,000. Basis widened in 2 harvest windows. Net revenue underperformed model, by enough that he surrendered leased ground to prevent deeper loss. He did not fail from laziness. He failed from compounded sensitivity. Nolan finally leaned forward. Everyone had sensitivity. Yes, Travis said. Not everyone had equal fragility. The third packet went to Mariah and Joel Benton. Their file included dealer invoices, financing terms, and payment notices they had shared confidentially with the board for restructuring talks. Travis handled it carefully, like he was handing over someone's family photographs. Dryer and handling system, $410,000. Tractor and planter bundle, $620,000. Opening terms looked attractive because the first period was designed to sell comfort. Then stepped obligations arrived into lower commodity pricing. Corn under $3.40, narrowed room. 3 missed payments by winter, 2019. Parcel sale to cure delinquency. He paused. They made a rational decision with incomplete foresight. That is all. Harold looked down at the amortization table, then up at Nolan. If a plan looks good only in stable weather, stable prices, and stable rates, is it really a plan for farming or just a plan for a brochure? No one answered him. Travis continued. Ellis Shaw's file was thinner and heavier at the same time. One guarantee signature had tied 2 operations together. Ellis guaranteed Tate's $1,200,000 operating line to secure terms and timing, Travis said. The intent was generational continuity, then variable costs and price pressures stacked against them. Cross-default provisions made separation hard once either operation slipped. Foreclosure proceedings in 2020. Auction losses not just financial, also strategic, because replacement costs later were higher. Harold rubbed his forehead and looked down. Priya Nolan's pages showed a different trap. Variable bridge note at 4.75% in a favorable cycle. climbed above 9% by 2022, feed costs elevated, fuel elevated, herd reduction forced to preserve payment status. She protected solvency by shrinking productive capacity. That is survival math, not growth math. The board members had known fragments of these stories. Seeing them side by side, with dates and rates and payment curves aligned, changed the temperature in the room. This was no longer a dispute about personalities. It was a decomposition of risk pathways under real volatility. Nolan tried once more to hold the old frame. You are proving that bad luck can happen. You are not proving leverage is wrong. Travis met his eyes. I am proving unmanaged leverage is lethal when volatility clusters. And I am proving we designed a system that rewards volume before resilience. Harold asked for specifics on the charter terms, and Travis gave them in short lines. Input credit exposure, capped at 22% of prior year gross for any individual producer without board exception. Variable rate contracts require side-by-side disclosure, current rate, worst-case historical range over 15 years, and dollar impact per 1% rise. Any seasonal incentive that increases debt load must include payment stress illustration under a low-price scenario. Hardship pool funded at 1.25% of annual net margin before performance bonuses. Board-level risk report quarterly, not annually. He did not raise his voice. He did not sell hope. He sold constraints. 3 days after that session, at 9:04 a.m., the lender's warning letter arrived in final form, and it removed any lingering appetite for denial. If Wabash River Grain failed to secure $2,800,000 in qualified equity by the stated deadline, the bank could suspend availability under the seasonal line and impose controlled settlement procedures. In plain language, grain delivery checks could be delayed or discounted under distress mechanics. Producers who had done nothing wrong could still be trapped in the blast radius. That was the systemic point Travis had been making. Zero debt on a farm balance sheet does not protect cash flow if the buyer across the scale cannot perform. The pressure showed up immediately, not as rumor, but as behavior. At Harlan Feed that afternoon, 2 account holders were told new purchases would clear on 15-day terms, unless prior balances came down. At Wednesday supper in the church basement, financing talks started at one table and ended after a glance toward the doorway where 2 lenders were standing with coffee cups. At Miller Fuel on Friday morning, office staff printed duplicate receipts for growers who had never asked for duplicates before. People were not panicking. They were bracing. At Wabash River Grain, the posted basis flickered with uncertainty while staff worked late, reconciling contract exposures and lender reporting requests. Nolan still came in early, still wore pressed jackets, still spoke about scale, but now he did it with a legal pad open because counsel had advised all managers to document communications during covenant stress. The style remained polished. The confidence had hairline cracks. Travis kept farming through it. He loaded his older wagons, checked moisture, serviced bearings, and drove the same 1996 Ford, now at 344,000 miles, into a yard full of newer trucks, financed, at rates their owners no longer discussed publicly. His coat was still mended. His gloves were still stitched. The visible story stayed the same. The hidden story moved one line at a time. On February 7th, one of his treasury tranches matured. $900,000 principal, plus accrued return. He met his banker before noon, confirmed same-day settlement availability, and requested transfer instructions that allowed certified disbursement on board authorization only. On February 9th, a second tranche matured. $1,250,000. On February 10th, he shifted both into a custodial account, prepared for immediate certified disbursement pending vote outcome. On February 11th, he moved an additional $700,000 into the same channel as contingent support if governance terms passed unanimously. Funds were real, liquid, and document. The crisis did not end there. It intensified. Caleb received revised operating terms from his lender with a higher spread and stricter collateral language. Maria and Joel were offered an extension that solved this quarter and worsened the next two. Ellis faced legal costs tied to title and restructuring deadlines. Priya had a narrow window to lock feed and refinancing before spring volatility returned. Good operators, all of them, none spared by reputation. Harold called an emergency vote session for Monday at 6:30 in the evening, same cinder block room, same dust and coffee smell, but this time with outside counsel present, lender observers dialed in, and producer representatives seated along the wall. Agenda Item 1 was Covenant Response. Agenda Item 2 was Governance Reform. Agenda Item 3 was Management Continuity. Nolan arrived with a prepared statement defending the existing growth model. Travis arrived with a cashier's check request form unsigned, waiting for conditions. One man brought language, the other brought liquidity. As dusk settled over Terra Haute, trucks lined the gravel lot outside the elevator office, headlights cutting through grain dust, and the county waited to see whether arithmetic would finally outrank appearance. Harold called the room to order at 6:34, read the lender deadline into the record, and asked Nolan to present management's recommendation first. Nolan stood, unfolded 2 pages, and spoke in the confident cadence people had heard for years, arguing that short-term covenant pressure should be met with temporary fee increases, wider credit utilization, and a deferred maintenance schedule that would protect growth trajectory. Counsel wrote without looking up. The producer representatives along the wall did not interrupt, but their faces told the story. They had heard trajectory language while neighbors sold ground. When Nolan finished, Harold turned to Travis and asked whether his alternative remained on the table under the same terms discussed in draft. Travis did not stand. He slid a single sheet toward counsel and waited until she nodded that it matched the prior draft language. Immediate equity infusion of $2,850,000. Additional conditional commitment of $600,000 available within 5 business days. Producer protection charter adopted in full, including exposure caps, fixed-rate disclosure rules, and a hardship pool funded before performance bonuses. Final condition, unanimous board approval, and Nolan Pike's resignation effective at quarter end, with 90 days of transition support to protect operations continuity. Nolan laughed once, short and brittle, then looked at Harold as if expecting the room to reject it on tone alone. Harold did not reject it. He asked counsel whether the conditions were enforceable. She said yes. The lender observer on speakerphone asked the operational question next. Can funds be verified tonight and settled without clawback risk? Travis reached into his coat, withdrew a cashier's check sealed in a clear sleeve, and set it beside the microphone where everyone could read the amount. $2,850,000 payable to Wabash River Grain Cooperative Equity Account. Drawn on First Wabash Trust. Same-day certified funds. He placed a second signed letter beneath it, committing the additional $600,000 contingent on unanimous passage, and executed charter filing by noon the next day. No flourish, no speech, paper, ink, amount, terms. Counsel inspected both documents, read routing numbers aloud for the minutes, and handed them to Harold. The room went quiet enough to hear the old fluorescent ballast hum. Nolan asked to see the check, and Harold passed it down. Nolan held it longer than necessary, turned it once, then called the issuing bank from his own phone on speaker. He identified himself, gave the instrument number, and asked for confirmation. The bank officer confirmed issuance, confirmed collected funds, and confirmed no hold condition. Nolan ended the call and sat back slowly. When Harold called the vote on charter adoption tied to equity terms, each director answered yes. When he called the vote on management transition under the same motion, each director answered yes again, including the director Nolan had recruited 2 years earlier. Nolan stared at the table for several seconds, then read his resignation statement into the record in a flat voice. I measured producer's strength by visible scale and recent volume. I did not measure balance sheet resilience with enough weight. That error is mine. By 9:12 that night, Council had filed the emergency governance package electronically and sent certified copies to the lender. At 8:07 the next morning, the bank acknowledged covenant cure subject to final equity posting, and by 10:41 the wire settled. 30 days later, Wabash River Grain refinanced at 6.2% fixed instead of the projected 9.4% variable path under distress terms. Seasonal line availability remained intact. Grain settlements normalized before spring planting. The hardship pool account opened with an initial transfer of $312,000 from retained margin and a board resolution that prohibited reclassification without supermajority vote. In the lot outside, Travis's 1996 Ford sat between 3 newer pickups with polished wheels, paint oxidation chalky under the yard lights, mirrors still tied with baling wire. The county had just watched the poorest-looking operator stabilize a regional buyer with cash. 3 weeks after the vote, Travis met Caleb Dunn at the same kitchen table, where he had run his own 2012 numbers. Caleb brought tax returns, lease history, and a folded map of the 120 acres he hoped to regain, ground that bordered a creek and had sold under pressure years earlier. Purchase price was $7,200 per acre, total $864,000, with seller willingness for a short close if equity was real. Travis's fund advanced $180,000 at zero interest as subordinated equity, 5-year term, payments beginning after year 2, with one condition in writing: no variable rate operating debt above the charter cap and one future assist to another producer within 5 years. With that equity, Caleb secured a fixed mortgage tranche for the balance at 5.9%, 20-year amortization, annual payment near $58,900 instead of a revolving structure that could have moved against him. He closed in 22 days. For the first time since surrendering leased quarters, he planted contiguous ground he owned again. Maria and Joel Benton came next, not for expansion, but for oxygen. The remaining high-rate equipment paper had split into 2 notes after restructuring, one at 10.8% and another at 11.4%. Combined outstanding principal, $247,300, monthly burden heavy enough to distort every input decision. The Thornton Working Ground Fund issued $220,000 zero interest to retire the higher rate note in full and reduce the second to a manageable remainder, refinanced fixed at 6.1%, through a local lender willing to participate under the new charter disclosure framework. Their monthly payment load dropped by $4,180. They redirected part of that relief into deferred dryer maintenance and part into a 12-month tax reserve. The same discipline Travis required in every agreement. They did not celebrate publicly. They sent one short thank you note and went back to work. Ellis Shaw refused help twice before accepting it once. Pride was part of that refusal, but so was fatigue from legal paperwork that had dragged his family through 2 years of cross-default complications. Travis did not push. He waited, then offered a specific package, $95,000 zero interest, disbursed directly to legal restructuring costs, title correction, and a controlled settlement with 2 creditors so the home place could be ring-fenced from remaining litigation risk. No cash handed over for general use. Every dollar a sign. Ellis signed after counsel walked him line by line through the protections. 6 months later, the home place title stood clear, smaller operation intact, and Tate Shaw operating under a tighter acreage plan with fixed obligations and no personal guarantee from his father. They lost scale. They kept continuity. Priya Nolan's file was the most technical and maybe the most revealing. Her herd reduction had preserved solvency but cut productive momentum, and she faced a narrow feed-buy window where delay would cost her through winter. Fund support totaled $140,000, split in 3 tranches, $62,000 for feed purchase timing, $48,000 for breeding stock replacement, and $30,000 reserved as closing support to secure fixed-rate refinancing on remaining variable exposure. She used all 3 exactly as written. Feed cost per unit came in 8.7% below her worst-case estimate because she could buy on schedule. Calving percentage recovered over the next cycle. The refinance closed at 6.35% fixed, replacing a structure that had climbed above 9%. Her operation did not return to prior size immediately, but it returned to stable planning horizons, which in agriculture is often the difference between survival and slow collapse. October 4th, 2024, first week review, conference room at the cooperative. Harold asked for operating results instead of speeches, and the first annual fund sheet moved seat to seat with coffee rings on the corners. Total disbursed principal to the 4 initial recipients, $635,000. Weighted average interest rate charged, 0%. Delinquency rate, 0. Required reserves established by recipients under covenant, all 4 compliant. Aggregate annual interest expense avoided versus pre-assistance pathways, conservatively modeled. $71,400 for Caleb, $50,160 for Maria and Joel, $18,900 in avoided penalty and legal escalation costs for Ellis, $29,500 for Priya. Combined annual pressure reduction, $169,960. Harold read the last number twice and wrote, "Stress removed from system," in the margin of his copy. January 2025, cooperative annual meeting, main floor chairs filled before start. Harold refused to let the rescue be reduced to one dramatic check, so he asked Travis for the full operating arithmetic and read it into the microphone himself. From 2010 through early 2023, Travis's no-term debt model generated cumulative, retained operating surplus sufficient to fund land purchases and liquidity build without external equity calls. In the same period, modeled interest cost avoided versus a moderate leverage path on comparable capital expenditures exceeded $2,300,000. Even after accounting for foregone tax shields and conservative opportunity cost assumptions, net resilience benefit remained substantial. He paused before the next line and looked toward the side wall where younger operators stood. When rates rose and covenants tightened, that stored resilience became deployable community capital within hours, not months. July 2025, mid-year governance checkpoint, binder tab labeled recipient conditions, Council logged status updates one file at a time instead of as a narrative. 2023 launch figures remained unchanged in the official record. $4 million endowment, $635,000 dispersed, cooperative stabilized, forced settlements avoided. Through 2024, 4 recipients had generated positive net income after debt service, none had required emergency extensions, and Caleb had initiated the first secondary assist under his 5-year condition through a vendor-backed arrangement. By this 2025 checkpoint, Maria and Joel had completed principal reduction milestones 6 months ahead of schedule and had assisted a neighboring operator with zero-interest equipment sharing during harvest crunch. Priya had funded a feed bridge for a younger ranch family under written repayment terms. Ellis and Tate had provided machinery access to a startup tenant on fixed cost terms rather than percentage rent. The secretary entered each action under compliance, not celebration. March 2026. Planning session before spring contracting. The board reviewed a forward model under current commodity assumptions and entered a projection tied to actual filed balance sheets. 4 restored operations controlling 2,740 acres and rebuilding combined net equity to approximately $7,900,000. Harold closed the session with one line that sounded plain and landed hard. Volume had looked like strength until volatility arrived. Resilience looked small until the bill came due. Nolan attended from the back row, retired from management, and doing consulting work for 2 regional groups, and he did not contest the numbers. September and November 2026, 2 county meetings in different halls with the same folding chairs and weak microphones. Nolan said publicly that his old model rewarded throughput and ignored survivability, and he now advised fixed-rate discipline, lower leverage ceilings, and transparent stress testing before any expansion package. Travis kept his routine. Same farmhouse bought in 1958 for $11,400. Same truck, now past 347,000 miles. Same habit of paying for parts before paint. His estimated net worth moved toward $19,600,000, mostly in land and liquid reserves positioned for the next disruption, not display. The elevator kept operating under the new charter. The hardship pool remained funded. And in a county that once mistook worn coveralls for weakness, the governing idea was finally clear enough to survive argument. Appearance can be theater, but arithmetic is truth. The sentence stayed in the room after Harold read it, and no one rushed to cover it with new language. People folded chairs, stacked binders, and drifted toward the hallway in twos, still talking in numbers instead of rumors. Travis stayed by the back wall until the last producer representative signed the attendance sheet. Then he walked to the office window, looked out at the gravel lot, and watched Caleb Dunn and Priya Nolan speaking beside a salt-streaked stock trailer under a yard light that hummed in the cold. Harold came over with the charter binder under his arm and asked one practical question. Can the second-generation assist requirement be tracked without becoming performative? Travis answered in 6 words. Track dollars, outcomes, and repayment behavior. Within 11 days, the cooperative secretary converted that instruction into a compliance ledger with 4 columns. Assistance deployed, purpose, performance window, and recipient carry-forward obligation. The first entries looked small against the county's total acreage, but their structure mattered. Caleb's required assist was recorded as a $42,000 vendor-backed input bridge for Lane Whitaker, a 31-year-old renter who had lost a fertilizer booking window after his lender tightened collateral language. Lane used the bridge to secure spring pricing, reduced his per-acre nutrient cost by $31 across 540 rented acres, and repaid in 9 months. Maria and Joel logged a non-cash assist first, then a cash one. They shared drying capacity and labor scheduling with Dana Ruiz during a wet October, then advanced $18,500 zero interest so Dana could avoid a 10.9% emergency note on a failed unload auger replacement. Dana repaid in 14 months and entered year 2 with a dedicated repair reserve for the first time. By the first week of August 2027, Priya's carry-forward file showed the clearest multiplier pattern. She issued a $27,000 feed bridge to a younger cattle couple, Reed and Alina Mercer, under fixed repayment dates tied to weaning sales rather than calendar guesswork. The bridge cost the Mercers nothing in interest and saved an estimated $6,400 versus local revolving terms. But the more important change came from covenant discipline she copied directly from Travis's documents. 12 months of tax and insurance set aside before equipment upgrades, and no variable debt above a capped percentage of prior year gross receipts. Ellis and Tate Shaw took a different route. They could not spare much cash early, so they wrote assistance as access, low-cost machinery time, fixed hourly fuel pass-through, and a written cap that prevented surprise billing. In 22 months, their support allowed 2 small tenants to harvest on time, avoid quality discounts, and preserve tenancy. Let me stop here and ask you something. If you had to choose between a larger operation today and a safer operation for the next rate cycle, which one would you choose, and what numbers would make that choice honest for you? The cooperative reviewed outcomes every quarter, and the arithmetic kept reinforcing the same point. Original fund disbursement to 4 primary recipients remained $635,000. Secondary and tertiary assists triggered by the 5-year condition reached $311,500 by mid-2028, spread across 9 additional producers and 2 livestock families. Total direct assistance in the chain, $946,500. Documented high-rate borrowing avoided across those cases, using signed alternative offers as baseline, $1,482,000. Estimated annual interest expense prevented at then prevailing rates, $132,700. Aggregate acreage stabilized or recovered by assisted operations, 4,130 acres. Combined net equity across the 4 original recipients and the first 9 carry-forward recipients, based on filed year-end statements, $12,460,000. One check had not solved agriculture. It had changed the risk geometry of one county by making discipline contagious. Nolan's resolution unfolded without drama, which suited the story better than a public reckoning. He completed his transition term, delivered clean handoff notes to operations staff, and left Wabash River Grain on schedule, with no severance dispute and no legal claim. For 6 months, he consulted quietly for 2 nearby cooperatives that had watched the covenant crisis from a distance and now wanted fixed-rate policy templates before their own lines came under pressure. At first, he spoke in technical language and avoided personal acknowledgement. That shifted at a winter meeting in Sullivan County when a producer asked whether he still believed visible scale was the strongest predictor of durability. Nolan paused, looked down at his slides, and answered plainly. No, liquidity and debt structure predict survival better than paint and horsepower. By spring 2028, he had become a peculiar but useful messenger, the former advocate of aggressive variable leverage, now teaching stress tests to managers who still wanted growth packages on marketing flyers. He built a worksheet that required 3 scenarios before any financed expansion recommendation could be approved: base, adverse, and clustered adverse with both rate and basis shock. He insisted each scenario include dollar impact per 1%, rate increase and payment timing under delayed settlements. Some people called it overcorrection. Nolan called it overdue arithmetic. He retired from paid consulting in 2030, then volunteered as a county workshop presenter twice a year, never billing for those sessions. He lived in Terre Haute, cared for his wife after her knee surgery, and kept bees behind their house on a quarter-acre lot. He did not return to elevator management. If you are learning something from this phase of the story, pass it to one person who still thinks debt risk is just about interest rates and not about timing, covenants, and who controls settlement when pressure arrives. Harold Vance stayed board chair through the 2029 cycle, then moved to an advisory seat by choice. He left with a governance record most directors would recognize as rare: covenant compliant in every quarter after the crisis cure, hardship pool funded above charter minimum each year, and 0 emergency settlement delays triggered by line freezes. Lane Whitaker expanded from 540 to 760 rented acres without signing variable paper beyond charter caps. Dana Ruiz replaced her auger and built a 3-bin reserve inventory of common failure parts, funded in cash each January. Reed and Alina Mercer rebuilt herd numbers gradually, not by borrowing for speed, but by sequencing replacement stock with fixed obligations they could carry under poor price years. Caleb Dunn's 120 acres became 200 by patient additions, all fixed rate, all stress-tested against lower corn assumptions than local lenders asked for. Maria and Joel Benton finished principal milestones early, then put their daughter on payroll with a written savings match instead of gifting her machinery debt. Ellis Shaw passed away in November 2029 at home, not in litigation, with title clean and family relationships intact. Tate kept the reduced acreage plan and resisted pressure to get big again when rates dipped briefly. Priya Nolan became the fund's most disciplined peer reviewer, known for asking one sharp question in every applicant interview: show me your plan if your best month does not arrive. By the second week of October 2030, the Thornton Working Ground Fund reported a clear roll call with no loose files. 4 original recipients, all active, all compliant, 1 deceased with succession completed under plan. 9 secondary recipients, 7 fully repaid, 2 current and on schedule. 2 tertiary assists, both current, both below exposure caps. Total disbursed, since inception, $1,108,500. Total principal repaid to revolving pool, $472,300. Active commitments outstanding, $636,200. Delinquency over 30 days, 0. Cooperative hardship pool balance, $1,140,000 after annual transfers and approved draws. These were not miracle numbers. They were durable numbers. Travis never relocated, never rebranded, and never gave long speeches unless a bylaw required him to explain terms for the record. His truck crossed 371,000 miles with the same mirror, finally replaced only because state inspection forced it. The 1978 Combine still worked on his acres as a backup machine after a major rebuild cycle that cost $28,400 over 3 winters, still lower than 1 year of payments on some newer financed units around him. He installed telematics on nothing. He installed discipline on everything. His house remained the same 1-story place his grandparents bought in 1958. porch rail repaired again, same kitchen table, same narrow-ruled columns. His estimated net worth moved above $22 million by land appreciation and retained liquidity, yet his annual household budget changed less than people expected. Security, not display, stayed the governing objective. Before this story closes, do 3 things if you want more cases like this one. Subscribe so you do not miss the next county ledger that looks ordinary until the math speaks. Comment with the one financial rule you would write into every cooperative charter if you had 1 vote tonight. Share this with the person in your life who confuses expensive equipment with durable wealth. At dawn on a clear Monday, Travis pulled into Wabash River Grain with a load scheduled, not rushed, and waited his turn on the same scale where people once measured him by rust and thread. The elevator office lights were on. Settlement windows were open on time. A younger clerk, trained under the charter era, verified moisture, weight, and contract terms, then handed him a ticket that matched exactly what the sheet said it should match. No whisper network, no theater, just numbers honoring agreements in a system built to survive strain. Around him sat newer trucks, older trucks, clean paint, faded paint, financed iron, paid for iron. The scale did not care. The ledger did not care. And in that county, after years of costly lessons, most people finally did not care either. They had learned the same thesis the hard way, and then wrote it into policy so memory would not fade with the next good year. Appearance can mislead, but arithmetic endures. By the first Tuesday of November 2030, the compliance ledger sat open on the cooperative conference table, and this time every column had supporting paper clipped behind it. The secretary had printed loan agreements, repayment receipts, feed invoices, equipment share logs, and signed carry-forward commitments, then stacked the older crisis documents at the end. The lender warning letter from 2023, council's charter filing confirmation, the cashier's check copy, and Travis's conditional $600,000 commitment letter marked executed and closed. Harold, now advisory, ran a finger down each line and asked for verbal confirmation anyway. "Caleb Dunn," he said. Caleb stood near the coffee urn and read from his own sheet. Original zero interest support, $180,000. Repaid principal to fund, $72,000 so far, current on schedule. Secondary assist, completed for Lane Whitaker, $42,000 vendor bridge, repaid in full. I also co-signed no variable paper beyond cap language. Maria and Joel Benton. Maria answered first. Original support, $220,000. High rate note retired. Remaining fixed balance current. Secondary assist to Dana Ruiz, $18,500, repaid. Drying share hours logged at 61 hours this season. Cost recovery only. Joel added 1 line. Tax reserve funded before harvest. Priya Nolan. Priya tapped a blue folder. Original support, $140,000, split as written. Repaid principal to fund, $51,000 to date. Secondary assist to Reed and Alina Mercer, $27,000 feed bridge, repaid. Third assist completed this summer to a beginning family through inventory financing, $19,000 current. Ellis Shaw file. The room quieted. Tate Shaw answered for that line, voice steady. Ellis passed in 2029. Home place remained ring-fenced per restructuring. Original $95,000 legal and title package fully deployed and closed. I am current on schedule. Machinery access assist delivered to 2 tenants, both off emergency borrowing. Harold nodded and wrote nothing theatrical, just check marks. The numbers had become routine, which was the point. When the secretary totaled the chain, direct and carry-forward assistance stood at $1,146,500 since its launch. Principal return to the revolving pool stood at 500 marks, $14,300. Active notes were all current. Delinquency over 30 days remained zero. Modeled high-rate borrowing avoided across document alternatives had climbed above $1,590,000. Combined net equity across the original four and downstream recipients reached $13,280,000 on filed statements. One disciplined intervention had multiplied through policy and repetition, not headlines. 3 days later, the lender's annual review call came at 8:10 in the morning. Harold put the phone on speaker, and the bank officer, the same institution that had issued the freeze threat in 2023, confirmed covenant compliance for every quarter since the cure, then approved renewal terms without emergency riders. The callback to the warning letter was complete and entered in the minutes. No one clapped. They moved to the next agenda item. Nolan's final resolution took shape in a room he used to dominate. In February 2031, at a county risk workshop in a livestock pavilion with concrete floors and folding chairs, he stood beside a projector screen and taught the stress test worksheet he once dismissed as overcautious. He did not dodge his own history. "I sold volume language and called it resilience," he said. "I was wrong." A young manager asked from the back row whether he had known, at the emergency vote, that his model had already failed. Nolan gave the answer people had wondered about since that night. "When I called the bank to verify that check and they confirmed collected funds, I knew the argument was over. I had been measuring the wrong signals for years." After the session, he and Travis spoke outside near the gravel lot while a cold wind moved dust along the fence line. Nolan looked at the old Ford, now with a legally required replacement mirror and a repaired rear spring pack that finally leveled the truck stance. "I used to think that truck was your weakness," Nolan said. "It was transport," Travis answered. Nolan gave a short laugh, more tired than bitter. "Fair." He handed Travis a printed packet of his new workshop slides. "I cite your charter language in this. No names unless asked." "Keep it useful," Travis said. Nolan had already retired from paid consulting in 2030. His 2031 and later workshops were unpaid county sessions each spring and fall. Then he went home to his bees and his wife's physical therapy schedule. He never returned to elevator management, and he stopped predicting who would survive by looking at paint. By mid-April 2031, planting windows opened under dry skies, and the roll call everyone had demanded for years could finally be read in present tense without qualifiers. Travis Thornton still operated from the same one-story farmhouse bought in 1958, still kept household spending plain, and still carried no term debt. His 1996 Ford crossed 379,000 miles. The baling wire mirror was gone by inspection order. The fatigued spring leaf had been replaced, and the truck remained what it had always been, a tool, not a statement. The 1978 Combine still ran as backup after stage rebuilds, with maintenance logs cleaner than many machines 30 years newer. Caleb Dunn farmed, owned, and rented ground with fixed structures only. His 120 regained acres now integrated into a larger but stress-tested plan. Maria and Joel Benton ran current on every note, maintained reserves first, and brought their daughter into the business under written savings rules rather than inherited debt. Priya Nolan rebuilt herd capacity methodically and became the fund's strictest reviewer of variable exposure requests. Ellis Shaw rested in the church cemetery above the river road. Tate Shaw kept the home place intact, smaller and safer, and declined 2 expansion offers that required personal guarantees. Lane Whitaker renewed leases on better terms after 2 compliant years. Dana Ruiz carried a parts reserve and no emergency note. Reed and Alina Mercer moved from bridge financing to self-funded feed timing and stayed inside cap language. Harold Vance kept his advisory seat and attended most quarterly reviews, usually saying little, until someone drifted into optimistic assumptions without downside math. Then he asked for the adverse case and waited. The board listened. The charter stayed unchanged except for clearer disclosure formatting adopted in 2032, and council recorded that amendment with unanimous consent. By the first week of September 2032, the secretary closed another annual file and archived the physical record properly. Original crisis documents went into a fireproof cabinet in the cooperative office. Warning letter, emergency minutes, check copy, commitment letter, filing confirmations, and first-year compliance logs. Digital scans were hashed, time-stamped, and mirrored to off-site storage. Nothing that mattered depended on memory anymore. Even the odd details people once joked about had found their place in the record. The wired mirror noted and replaced. The old ballast hum in the conference room eliminated when lights were upgraded. The rusted truck still present but mechanically sound. The patched coveralls still in rotation because function beat image. At dawn on an October Monday in 2033, almost 24 years after Nolan first dismissed him, Travis eased the Ford onto the same scale at Wabash River Grain. Moisture check, weight ticket, contract match, settlement window open on time. The clerk slid the printed ticket across the counter, and it matched the posted terms down to the cent. Outside, newer trucks idled beside older ones, financed machines beside paid-for machines, polished chrome beside faded paint. No one treated that as a hierarchy anymore. Travis folded the ticket once, put it in his shirt pocket, and walked back toward a truck that had never tried to impress anyone. Behind him, the elevator kept moving grain under policies written by people who had paid dearly to learn what lasts. In front of him, fields waited on weather that no one could control. Between those facts sat the only thesis that had survived every rate cycle, every covenant scare, and every coffee shop verdict in the county. Appearance performs, arithmetic endures.